We live in the luckiest country in the world, don't we? We have amazing beaches, endless natural resources, and a great standard of living. Australia, one of the richest countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita, has been experiencing 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth, or at least it was until the pandemic. So how is it that in such a rich country, the average Australian can no longer afford to own a home? How is it that with so many natural resources, our economic future is so uncertain? The story I'm going to tell you today is the story of an economy that looks rich but is actually poor. It's like the story of an unlucky gambler who won the lottery but lost his money gambling. Is the Australian economy really failing, or is it just a story of mismanaged failure? Let's examine it together. First of all, let's start with some striking figures. Australia has almost tripled its GDP per capita in the last 30 years, from around $18,000 in 1990 to over $60,000 today. This is one of the most impressive growth stories among developed countries. But wait a minute, what do these numbers really mean? Do they accurately reflect our true economic prosperity, or are they hiding a more complex and worrying reality? Economists call it the resource curse. Having a lot of valuable minerals underground makes countries rich, but it also makes their economies overly dependent on a single sector. Australia has generated incredible revenues from natural resources such as iron ore, coal, and natural gas. Since the early 2000s, especially with the rise of China, our mining sector has been the driving force of our economy. The numbers are really striking. In the early 2000s, Australia's iron ore exports amounted to around $10 billion annually, while in 2020, this figure exceeded $100 billion, a tenfold increase. This massive influx of money has generated billions of dollars in tax revenues for federal and state governments, created thousands of high-paying jobs, and spilled over into other sectors of the economy. So if we made so much money during this period, why do we feel so vulnerable? Because we did not diversify our economic prosperity. While countries like Norway saved their oil revenues in a sovereign wealth fund, we spent our earnings on consumption, the real estate bubble, and short-term prosperity. We have experienced an economic condition known as Dutch disease. The boom of natural resource exports increases the value of your currency and reduces the competitiveness of your other export sectors. As a result, sectors such as manufacturing and technology weaken because it is now more expensive to sell overseas. It's no coincidence that the advanced manufacturing sector is almost non-existent in Australia today. Our automotive industry has collapsed. Electronics manufacturing has shifted to Asia, and many of our innovative technology companies have either been bought by foreigners or moved their operations overseas. Here's another striking fact. Nearly 40% of our exports go to China. For any major economy in the world, this is an unprecedented level of dependence on a single country. Initially, this looked like a great economic opportunity. We were supplying raw materials for China's growth, in return for record-breaking export revenues. But now we are facing the dark side of this dependency dilemma. If the Chinese economy slows down, which is exactly what has happened in recent years, our economy reacts disproportionately. When China's construction industry suffers, our iron ore prices fall. When China's energy policy changes, our coal industry is shaken. When Australia called for an independent investigation into how COVID-19 emerged, China immediately retaliated economically, imposing tariffs and bans on Australian products such as wine, barley, beef, and coal. It was a striking example of how economic interdependence intersects with national security and sovereignty. We are now facing a challenging reality. Expanding into new markets like India, Vietnam, Indonesia is not easy and will take time. Moreover, these countries are nowhere near China's economic size and purchasing power. Meanwhile, China is grappling with its own internal problems: the real estate crisis, demographic challenges, rising debt levels, and its growth rate is falling. This signals a serious danger for the Australian economy. Australia's other great economic paradox lies in its housing market. Sydney and Melbourne have some of the most expensive real estate markets in the world. The average house price is more than 10 times the average Australian's annual income. This is one of the worst ratios among OECD countries. The average house in Sydney costs over $1.2 million. This is equivalent to about 15 years of gross salary for the average Australian. For comparison, In the US, it is around 5 years. In Germany, around 6 years. And even in an expensive city like London, around 8-9 years. For young Australians, home ownership has become an Australian dream. The housing crisis is not only an economic problem, it is also turning into a deep social problem. Wealth inequality between generations is growing. While the baby boomer generation, born between 1946 and 1964, has benefited from the real estate boom, generations Y and Z are struggling with rising rents and unaffordable house prices. This is reducing social mobility and eroding Australia's image as an egalitarian society. We feel strange. We are one of the richest countries in the world. Yet younger generations are losing hope of homeownership and are condemned to live in rented houses. Meanwhile, those who invest in the housing market and the real estate rich get richer on paper. But it does nothing for economic productivity. Moreover, the housing crisis has a negative impact on innovation and productivity. People are spending more and more of their monthly income on rent, which reduces consumption and quality of life. Do you know what Australia's biggest export after mining is? Education. Our universities attract students from all over the world, especially from Asia. This has become an industry worth close to $40 billion a year. Before the pandemic, there were approximately 750,000 foreign students in Australia. This is about 3% of our total population. These students, mostly from China, India, Nepal, and other Asian countries, were not only paying university tuition fees, but also making a huge contribution to the economy by spending on accommodation, food, transportation, and entertainment. But this success story has a dark side. Our universities have become increasingly dependent on foreign student fees. During the pandemic, with the closure of borders, this source of income was abruptly cut off, and many universities experienced major financial difficulties. Thousands of academic staff lost their jobs. Programs were cut, and research projects were suspended. This showed how fragile the business model of our universities is. Our leading universities derive 30–40% of their total budget from foreign student fees. This means that we depend on foreign students to sustain our research programs, academic staff, and quality of education. Moreover, local students feel like second-class customers. University tuition fees are constantly rising, but the quality of education is not improving at the same rate, and graduates face mounting student debt and an increasingly competitive job market. This skewed incentive structure in our education system creates a profit-driven, student-customer relationship model, rather than encouraging real innovation and research. In the long term, this weakens Australia's capacity to develop human capital. Australia's other economic challenge is a lack of innovation. Our R&D spending is below the OECD average. Our patent filings are low compared to other advanced economies. And our brightest young talent is often looking for opportunities overseas, particularly in the United States. A few more statistics. Australia spends only 1.8% of its GDP on R&D. This is considerably lower than Israel's 4.9%, South Korea's 4.8%, and Switzerland's 3.2%. This is partly due to the structure of our economy. Sectors like mining and real estate can bring high profits, but do not require major technological innovations. Countries without natural resources, such as Switzerland, Israel, and South Korea, have had to innovate to survive. We have been lucky, perhaps too lucky. This is exacerbated by Australia's brain drain problem. Our most talented scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs often move to innovation hubs like Silicon Valley, London, or Singapore, because there they find better research funding, bigger venture capital, more generous tax incentives, and more dynamic ecosystems. Reversing this brain drain and keeping Australian talent here is critical to our economic future. But this requires a policy shift that invests more in R&D, encourages risk-taking and entrepreneurship, and puts innovation at the heart of our economic strategy. The solutions to many of Australia's economic problems are known. Economists, analysis reports, and even the government's own committees have been saying for decades what needs to be done. Reform our tax system, encourage innovation, regulate the housing market, diversify our economy. But most of these recommendations have never been fully implemented. Why? Because short-term political thinking trumps long-term economic planning. Our 3-year election cycle, encourages politicians to pursue short-term, popular policies instead of long-term, structural reforms. Real estate speculators, mining companies, and other powerful interest groups exert enormous political pressure to maintain the status quo. But a lack of political will has prevented many of these reforms from materializing. Both major political parties are afraid to make major changes that could upset the status quo. And to be honest, we Australians are resistant to change too. Those who benefit from ever-growing house prices, those who enjoy tax benefits, and those who win under the current system form a powerful lobby against change. We have had 8 prime ministers in the last 20 years, which has made consistent, long-term policy implementation more difficult. Prime ministers and governments come and go, but our economic problems persist and deepen. Is there a solution? To say that the Australian economy is failing is perhaps too pessimistic a view. After all, we are still a rich country, with high living standards and many economic advantages. Our natural resources, stable institutions, highly educated population, and strategic location in the Asia-Pacific region put us in a better position than many countries. But we have to recognize that we have serious structural problems, and these problems need to be solved. Here are some things we can do. Develop a serious national strategy to diversify our economy. Encourage a shift from the natural resource sector to high value-added sectors such as advanced technology, renewable energy, biotechnology, and digital services. Introduce tax reforms that encourage innovation and entrepreneurship. Increase tax incentives for R&D, facilitate venture capital investments, and speed up patent registration processes. Reduce speculative investment in the housing market and make homeownership more accessible. Reassess negative gearing and capital gains tax benefits. Increase the stock of affordable housing and create support programs for first-time homebuyers. Restructure our education system as the foundation of our future economic success, not just a revenue-generating industry. Support local students, promote research excellence, and strengthen industry-university collaboration. Save part of the revenues from natural resources in a sovereign wealth fund for future generations. This could be inspired by Norway's model for managing oil revenues and provide long-term economic stability. Develop more aggressive policies to reverse the brain drain and attract top talent, such as tax incentives for skilled migrants, generous grant programs for researchers, and special visa programs for international entrepreneurs. Making strategic investments to adapt to climate change and transition to a green economy. Australia is rich in renewable energy sources such as solar and wind, and we have the potential to be a global leader in these areas. These are not easy solutions and may require some painful adjustments in the short term, but in the long run, they will make the Australian economy more sustainable and resilient. The Australian economy has not failed yet, but there are danger signals. Our wealth of natural resources has led us to drowsiness. Climate change, geopolitical tensions, and changing global economic dynamics show that our current economic model is not sustainable. The pandemic and the subsequent global supply chain crises have once again demonstrated the importance of economic resilience. For an economy as remote and dependent on foreign trade as Australia, diversity and self-sufficiency are critical. We are at a turning point right now. Either we will take bold steps to transform our economy and adapt to future challenges, or we will cling to our cozy status quo and gradually continue to lose our global competitiveness. If we don't act now, we could face a real economic failure in the future. But with the right policy choices and a long-term vision, the Australian economy can revive and deliver prosperity for future generations. Australia's potential is enormous. We have an educated workforce, strong institutions, political stability, and strategic position. We have all the tools needed to build a diversified, innovative, and sustainable economy. All we need is political will and visionary leadership. The question is, do we have the political will to make the necessary changes? Or are we going to continue to pursue this economic model that looks rich and is actually poor? Share your thoughts in the comments section. And if you found this video useful, please don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel. I regularly produce content for economic analysis and in-depth discussions. See you in the next video.